السلام علیکم بینندگان عزیز. امیدوار هستم که در هر نقطه دنیا باشین خوش و آرام باشین. امروز در برنامه ما در صدای حق تلویزیون بکتاش جان احدی را داریم و امروز راجع به بسیار چیزهای مهم صحبت میکنیم. یکیش که است PTSD است و همچنان بکتاش جان بسیار یک بک‌گراند فوق‌العاده داره و شروع میکنیم بخیر اول از این که بایوگرافیشان رو بخوانیم که شما امروزشان بلد شوین. I'm going to do it in English, of course. Good afternoon. I hope everybody is doing well today. I hope you had an amazing week. Better than last week, I would say. We have today Baktash Ahadi. He is going to be on our show today. Thank you so much for joining us. I will read a very brief biography. Baktash John is the founder of Talim. Talim is a strategic communications company. He's also the creator and host of the Stories of Transformation podcast. The tragic events of 9/11 set him on a path of examining why people do what they do. Upon graduation from college, he decided to serve in the Peace Corps as an educator in a rural village in Mozambique. His father learned English from a Peace Corps volunteer in Kandahar in the 1960s, and that experience was the inspiration for his family to come to the United States. After completing his service in the Peace Corps, Baktash John went back to Afghanistan, the country of his birth, to serve as a combat interpreter and cultural advisor for 3 years, supporting military and reconstruction efforts throughout the country. And this life-changing experience put his Afghan-American identity on the front line on the war on terror in Afghanistan. After his service in Afghanistan, Baktash John produced and translated a number of award-winning documentary films about free speech, photojournalism, the refugee crisis, and violence against women. He writes, speaks, and teaches regularly about individual, organizational, and societal change. He holds degrees from Johns Hopkins University and Susquehanna University. Baktash John, I wish کاش که من میتونستم کل زیر ترجمه کنم. متاسفانه امکاناتش نیست. خوش آمدین در برنامه ما بکتاش جان. Welcome. We would love to hear from your own words a little bit about yourself and your background. بفرمایید.
مهربانی، تشکر فرشته جان. بسیار خوش هستم که اینجا هستم رایتان صحبت میکنم. تشکر از این فرصت. ما مستمیشه در خدمت شما هستم. درست ما در خود کابل پیدا شدم در سال 1981. باز خود میفهم در مو وقتا جنگ شروع شد. 2 سال قبل از او جنگ شروع شد. باز پدرم زندگی زو در خطر بود. باز در ظرف 1 روز بابیم که خانه آمد، مادرم گفت که مال خود کالای خود اشتکار جمع کن، ما فرار میکنیم. باز در ظرف 7 روز 6 شب امرای کمک خود مجاهدین در وقت فامیل ما اصلا فرار کرد. در بین کوههای افغانستان شو در بین قریات ما چی میکردیم؟ خواه میکردیم. در بین چیز گفته در بین کیوز و چیزها خواه میکردیم. باز روزکی خود پت میکردیم از خود روسا، قوای روسا. and قسم که من میگم براتون این قصه خود من نیست، چون که در وقت هیچ یاد من نیست. من 3 ساله بودم که ما فرار کردیم. این حالا جالبش است که از لحاظ روانشناسی خیلی ببخشید روانشناسی خودش تک نمیز سن سال 3 که باشه در وقت مموری شروع میشه، قبل از او هیچ نیست. So why is this important? The way we kind of understand memory is really important as it pertains to understanding who we are. Says? And so امی قصه که با امرای شما شریک میسازم، ای اصلا قصه خود من نیست، قصه مادر پدرم هست. And all the جالب چیز که through the years their story is now my story. And I think that's really important as people kind of think about who they are and their notion of identity in this world that we kind of live in. Says? باز بعد از افروز 6 ما با خود پاکستان رسیدیم. باز بدبختانه در موج 2 سال زندگی کردیم. In refugee camps, in makeshift homes. And luckily, my father knew a little bit of English. and he had worked for USAID in the 1970s. باز از طریق خود شبکه پدرم و انگلیسی که خودش یاد داشت، خودش میتونست که خود یک سازمان در خود امریکا پیدا کنه. And so we were sponsored by a Christian organization in Pennsylvania that brought us to the United States. And ما در وقت 5 ساله بودم. هیچ یادم نیست که چطور خود کشیدم از افغانستان. خاطرهای اول زندگی ما در پاکستانم بود. افغانستان هیچ یادم نیست. So I share this with you because it's the foundation for me wanting to do all the other things in my life.
Sure.
Right? And so I grew up in a small little college town, and I didn't have any Afghans around me. I didn't have the diaspora. I didn't have that connectivity to understand where I came from. I didn't have that connectivity. The only connective tissue that I had to the homeland was my parents. And what's really curious about that is that my parents didn't have the language to actually interpret what was happening in our lives and share that with me. So, Zaban Darir Khoban, Farsi Shaban, what I mean by language is the actual framework for understanding where they were in the world and what brought them to the world that we were living in. And so they weren't able to kind of direct me and my brothers in terms of where to go, what to do, how to kind of operate and navigate in that landscape. And so that was the foundation for our lives. And I'm sure the story that I'm kind of sharing about my life is very similar to not just yours, but to many Afghans our age, right? To many Afghans that came here in the 1980s before globalization occurred, before the world kind of entered the United States and the United States entered the rest of the world. So with that kind of backstory, went to college in 2001, 9 days after I started college, 9/11 happened. And as you well know, and as everybody knows, that's when Afghanistan came back on the map, not just for Afghans, but for the rest of the world. And so as much as we try, you cannot escape your Afghanness. You can't escape your Afghan identity because as hard as you try, the world pulls you back into it. They'll ask you things like, Farishta John, غیر تو از کجا هستن، کجا ایستن، او خوادیست. میگن که خود چرا افغانان انت فکر میکنن؟ چرا افغانا اقدر سر خانمای خود ظلم میکنن؟ افغانا چرا قدر کم حوصله هستن؟ They will ask you this as though you know the answers. So what's really curious about it is you can't escape it. هیچ امکان نداره. So as I started to realize that I couldn't escape my sense of Afghanness anymore, Farishta John, what did I do? I embraced it. I did the opposite. And so this may resonate with a lot of your listeners, but I think it's really important to understand that during that time, especially, it was nearly impossible to escape who we were and what we represented, whether we liked it or not.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing such a personal journey. I think it's incredibly important for our viewers to know that and to relate to this narrative. This narrative is no secret to any of us, whether we were born here to parents of refugees such as myself, whether we came here when we were in infancy or a young age, the story remains the same. Our parents were in survival mode, and they were constantly trying to make it from day to day in a very, very foreign land. And I commend you on sharing that, and I commend you on using that for your work. 9/11, interestingly enough, for our generation has been a very strong, life-changing experience. I've spoken about it on the show, about my own personal experience as well. And it's interesting because when you were talking about the questions that are asked constantly, I give cultural competency training to resettlement agencies. And after my presentation or during my presentation, hands are raised. And how come the men don't let the women speak?
How can I get the man to let the woman work? And I always chuckle and I always say, these are really personal questions. I know that you think this is cultural, but I have a lot of clients whose wives and husbands, very supportive husbands. As a matter of fact, I was calling a roster of people yesterday for this show, this program that's coming up that I'll be teaching on attachment and stress and trauma with children under 6 to mothers. And every single husband, I think it was 6 husbands in a row that I called, were supportive and on board with the idea that their wives will be taking this class and will be. So it's very interesting, the perspective that the West has. But, no surprise there. I'm sure you would agree. There's no surprise there. And it's really, really important to address these things. I wanted to play, if I could, Baktash, John, we're so incredibly proud of you that you did this amazing TED Talks. I wanted to play a clip and then circle back on the topic of the day today, if that would be با اجازه شما یک کلیپ TED Talks دارم میخواستم نشان بدم باز بعد از این سر اصل هدف خود میایم.
Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Good. Just want to take a moment right now to kind of thank everybody behind the scenes, everybody here involved with TEDx. You guys are doing a great job. Because of you, we're all here. So thank you for that. I'm here to talk about vulnerability. I'm here to talk about vulnerability as a way to change and as a way of finding transformation. People ask me what I do, and I have the hardest time answering that question. And ultimately, I think I'm a student of the human condition. I'm really curious to know more about people and the reasons as to why they do the things that they do. And everything that you see, everything that we do, I believe, is involved in story. And so as it pertains to vulnerability, I think when we hear vulnerability, we think of vulnerability as a negative thing. We see it as a sign of weakness. And we see it being exposed and being wounded as something that is not desirable. But, with the short time that I've been on this planet, I realize that's not necessarily the case. I'm going to share 3 stories that kind of demonstrate how vulnerability can lead to the opposite. It can lead to something more desirable. So I have these note cards because, I'm Afghan. If you let me up here on the stage, I can talk for hours. So this is going to keep me on track. And so first and foremost, I'd like to talk about my parents. My parents are from Afghanistan. I was born in Afghanistan. My father was taught by a Peace Corps volunteer in the 1960s in Kandahar, when Peace Corps was first starting out. And he learned English and eventually got to work with USAID in Kabul. And then, as everybody knows, in 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And so at that time, my father was working for the Soviet-backed Afghan government. And one day, he was given an ultimatum. Either you're going to essentially adopt our ideology or else. So that night, he comes home, tells Mom, pack up the bags, we're leaving. And up until this point, my mother never left her neighborhood in Kabul. And so, as my parents had to do, they got on horseback, took me and my brother, and went 7 days and 6 nights from Kabul to Peshawar, Pakistan. And over the course of 6 days and 7 days and 6 nights, my parents, we, hid under the cover of night and slept during the day in caves and villages along the way. And we had to avoid gunships and, death along the way. But through the grace of God, we eventually got to the refugee camp in Peshawar, where millions of other Afghans were. Spent 2 years in Pakistan. And through the English that my father learned and the names that the people they became friends with, he went to the consular office in Islamabad. And the consular officer essentially checked his story out. And we were granted political asylum to come to the United States. And and we land in a small little place called Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And Carlisle, Pennsylvania, as you well know, as you may know, is not New York City. And my parents expected to be landing in New York City. I mean, isn't all of America like New York City? You know, tall buildings, big screens, money grows on trees, a good life. Lo and behold, did we realize the place that we landed represented Afghanistan more than represented the United States. People had beards, we lived close to the Amish. The world's a funny place. So my parents started from scratch. We had nothing. We had a group of people that supported us and taught my parents and taught us how to live again, how to shop, what taxes meant, how to live. And, you know, as a kid, you don't know any better. You know, you don't know what's good, what's wrong. You essentially just are exposed to these different things. And as a kid, I didn't know, like, we were starting from scratch. Until one day later on, you know, I realized I was 11 years old, and I realized my parents at this point, we were doing okay. And I was sitting in the living room with my dad, and there was a photo of his mom, my grandmother, on the table. And as Afghan men do, we don't really talk when we're with each other about our feelings. And so we're just kind of enjoying the silence. And I remember looking over at my dad, and he's staring at this photo of his mother, and he starts to cry. And it was the first time I've ever seen my father cry. And what's really interesting about it is that simple moments can unravel people. And in that moment, I realized that vulnerability means strength.
And that is exactly my next point. What a beautiful story that you shared about your father, very similar to a lot of men from that generation and from Afghanistan. You talk about vulnerability, and you talk about how your father finally showed his emotions. And in your writing, you write about isolation and being alone. And it reminded me of one of my favorite novels by Albert Camus, L'Étranger. I'm not sure if you've ever read it before. But when I was studying French, it was one of my favorite till today novels. And the reason why it is one of my favorite novels is because it talks about this human condition of psychologically and mentally, although, you know, metaphorically, if you think about it, I mean, yes, physically he was in prison, but he was talking more so about his mental status of being isolated and being alone. And when I read this in your writing, it really struck a chord with me, and I really wanted to get into some discussion about it. So tell me a little bit about that. Tell me about this isolation and this vulnerability and this feeling of being alone in your life and what you had mentioned in your writing.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the question. I appreciate the opportunity to speak about this topic. I haven't listened, just as a quick aside, I haven't listened to that, to my TED Talk in a very long time. And so to hear, it's interesting how listening to oneself years after something happens is a wonderful mirror into oneself. So I appreciate you sharing that as well. Yeah, as I think about the single most important as I think about the most important things as it pertains to who we are in relation to other people, what ends up happening is I realize that human beings, in particular men from our cultural background, demonstrate and show who they are to other men and in relation to other men and also other women by sharing their accolades, sharing the things that make them seem as though there is a success, not only in the eyes of the people in the company that they keep, but also their own eyes. And so in this way, we're socialized to essentially only share the positive, only share the things that we've been able to obtain. And when we talk about the things that are, I would say, difficult to discuss, or in some sense, the ugliness of what it means to be human, we always talk about other people. And what's really, I think, a major sign of maturity and a major sign of growing up, Frishta John, is the ability to talk about the inner landscape that we all kind of deal with, right? What's curious is that, we, the single most important person in our lives is ourselves. And that person tends to be the person we are the most harsh with, and we're the most critical of, and the one that we are constantly battling, right? And so, as somebody who came back from Afghanistan as a combat interpreter, came back after being in Afghanistan for 3 years, seeing the country through and through, seeing the good and the bad, seeing the good, the bad, and the ugly that war can do to people, and that what war not simply does to people, but what it reveals in us to other people and to ourselves. The phenomena of fight or flight is absolutely true. And what happens is, when crisis occurs, there is the notion of fight or flight that kind of happens. But what's interesting is, after the fact, until you take a moment to reflect, that's when you start to realize how difficult the thing that you just experienced was. Like, in the moment, it's not when you do it. Later on is when it happens. And what I mean to say is, in the context of combat, you will find, it was rare to kind of find men cry. They would cry later. It was almost a thing that caught up with them, that caught up with us. And so I share that with you because it's a runway to kind of better understand, in the moment, we don't know what to do. Later on, if we don't confront the things that we've always been running from, those thoughts get stronger and they get heavier and they almost become a burden, right? So this may resonate with you. So the idea of folding into oneself happens if you don't confront it. And then this is the most important thing, sharing those things out loud. Because, Farishta John, I'm in a place in my life where I don't know if thoughts are real until you share them.
Right. And that notion of suppression is so incredibly strong. It's a silent, I always say it's a silent struggle. To continuously suppress feelings turns into a silent struggle, a struggle that nobody sees, a struggle that nobody hears. It's internal, and it can be just as toxic as any other illness, terminal illness, whether it be cancer or whether it be, and a lot of mental health studies have shown that people who suppress those feelings for several years later on end up getting very, very terminal illnesses. فرصی میخواستم یک کم وره ترجمه کنم بکتاشتانه که اونا صحبت میکردن راجع به ازی احساسه که برای مردم، مخصوصا مردم افغان، بسیار خیلی سخت میباشه که بتونن که احساس خود بگوین زبانی و همیشه امی احساسات خود نگاه میکنن، به دل خود نگاه میکنن و در دل که نگاه کنی کینه میتونه آدم کینه نگاه میکنه و این بسیار برای انسان خطرناک میباشه و بعد از بسیار چندین سال نتیجه بسیار منفی داره و هم برای اعصاب آدم، هم برای از نگاه روانی، سایکولوژی نتیجه خوب نداره و بختشتان هم گفتن که بسیار مهم است که آدم این احساسات خود بلند بگوید برای بلند بگوید. It's like it almost sounds awkward saying it, like say it out loud. And I say this to my clients all the time, just say it, you know. And I will make an observation here, but for my Afghan American brothers out there, that I will say that once you get, and one of my areas, my specializations is counseling men who have been abused and who abuse. And one of the things that I realize, especially for those who abuse, is that, or have been abused, is that they, once you get them to talk and once you get them to say their feelings out loud, it's very hard to stop that. It's like opening up a valve, and it's like opening up the floodgates, and then sky's the limit after that. It's not an easy thing to kind of یک دفعه که باز ماشاءالله شروع کردن و بلند گفتن احساسات خود، باز دیگه پخش کردنش یا ختم کردنش مشکل میشه. So thank you for talking about that. And something that we've talked about before on the show, we've glossed over, it's come up over and over again, has been trauma, different kinds of trauma. I know personally, as an Afghan American, I carry a lot of trauma with me in my life, and I've had to work through that trauma for many, many years, different levels, different kinds. But since we're talking about Afghan American identity, and since we're talking about displacement and the plight of a refugee, I wanted to talk about the number one thing that I deal with, at least with Afghan refugees and with people of our diaspora, is PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. And Baktash, I'm sure you would agree that it's very important for us to understand first what that is, and then we can kind of delve into the nitty-gritty of it. So PTSD is a disorder in which a person experiences something traumatic. It can be eyewitness, it could be secondary trauma through somebody else, but really it's experiencing or witnessing a terrifying event in their life. And they have a lot of difficulty overcoming this. This traumatic memory stays with them over the course of years. And if not dealt with, it can come with intense emotional reactions, physical reactions. Sometimes we see this on television. I know I watch This Is Us. I don't know who watches This Is Us. It's a very intense show. And they address PTSD with the Vietnam War. And there's a character there who shows the signs of PTSD from, she's a soldier. She was a soldier, and she comes back, and something happens, a very loud noise happens, and she reacts. PTSD که هسته یک تکلیف روانی هسته که وقتی که یک انسان یک چیز بسیار تراژی بسیار بزرگ سرش تیر میشه، یک شوک، یک در حالت شوک میایه یک انسان، مخصوصا امروز راجع به جنگ گپ میزنیم افغانستان، اما میتونه که هر چیز باشه. PTSD زیادتر در جایایی که جنگ می باشه یک چیزی را شایدی میگی و چشم خود میبینی که سر تاثیر میکنه و تاثیرهای بسیار جسمی می باشه، عصبانی. دیگه میخواستیم در راجع به از او کم وارد صحبت کنیم امروز. So Baktash, going back to that point, and you personally, I first of all want to thank you in advance for your courage and your brevity and opening up about your personal struggle with PTSD, and whatever you feel comfortable sharing and whatever you want the audience to know, we would love to hear from you, because I know 99.9% of us, that's a big number, but I can say that we all suffer from it in one way or another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. I think it's, I think mental health is one of the single most important things to kind of discuss, not just in our community, but here in the United States. I share this with you because although many of us are a product of war, it's also important to remember that the United States has sent over 1 million people, to include soldiers, to Afghanistan. And so it's important to know that the number of people that are killed from the effects of PTSD via suicide are higher than the actual number of soldiers that are killed in combat. Okay? So that is extremely important to understand. And it's extremely important to help us frame that PTSD is something that I realized and learned is a normal reaction to an environment. Meaning, if a human being is exposed to trauma, in particular, violence and trauma that they are unable to kind of control, then the reactions in which they have as a matter of psychology, meaning having an overt reaction to a sound that sounds like a bomb, or dreams that wake you up in the middle of the night, or anxiety when you're around a whole bunch of people. These are actually normal reactions from being exposed to and are experiencing trauma. So I think it's important to recognize that the person who has PTSD or who suffers from symptoms and the aftermath of PTSD is actually quite normal. I think that's the thing that I learned, is that what's interesting is that the West, we live in so much privilege here in the United States that when you tell somebody that you have suffered from, that you deal with PTSD, or that you suffer from the aftermath of conflict or war, that they see you as the problem. Meaning they see that you have a problem that is actually your fault. So that is extremely important to understand, because after some time of coming back from Afghanistan, I realized that the framework for me understanding what I was going through was absolutely wrong. Meaning what I was dealing with and what millions of other people who spent time in Afghanistan, Iraq were dealing with was actually normal. It was an actual, the response we were having was a normal response to what we saw and experienced, right? So then I started to question the fact, like, wait a second, if my response is normal, then why is it that people in the West, or the West in its essence, has a difficult time discussing it? Who has the problem? Is the problem me, or is the problem the fact that we can't discuss it? And that gave me the window to kind of say, okay, I'm going to open this door. I'm going to open this window so we can essentially get some, to add a metaphor to this, get some air in this room. Meaning, let's talk about it. Right?
من بکتاش جان امیر داری بگوین بسیار کمک میکنه برای بینندگان.
میشه. هو کوشش خود میکنم دیگه. ما خود قسم که ما تشریح کردم امی مشکلات که خود ما میبینیم از لحاظ روانشناسی، چیزایی که ما دیدیم، چیزایی که ما تجربه کردیم، خصوصا در جنگ، خصوصا در خشونت کس، اصلا گناه ما نیست. یکی گناه ما نیست. ما اولی رو باید قبول کنیم که گناه ما نیست که چیزا رو تجربه کردیم، گناه ما نیست که این چیزا رو دیدیم. یکی دوم، اینجا که بیایی خود جامعیت امریکایی و غرب که باشه، فکر میکن گناه ماست که چیزا رو دیدیم، در حالی که نیست. The second thing, قسمت دوم کس، چیزایی که ما احساس میکنیم، چیزایی که ما میبینیم، خواب که ما میبینیم، این اصلا بسیار نرمال است، اصلا بسیار عادی است. یعنی که بازم دیگه قسم که ما گفتم پیشتر، گناه ما نیست، به خاطر که چیزایی که ما میبینیم، چیزایی که ما تجربه میکنیم، این اصلا یک normal response، یک نتیجه بسیار گفته خوب در فارسی عادی، گفت یک نتیجه بسیار عادی است. یعنی که if we don't act this way, that's abnormal.
Then there's a problem. Yes, exactly. Then there's a problem. Agreed.
در مالت باز غیر عادی است.
بله.
And so that's one thing از لحاظ یک طرز فکر هر کس که می چیزا رو که دیدن امی ضرر که دیدن چیزایی که اینا احساس میکنن این اول باید قبول کنین.
بله.
Another thing that we have to kind of consider is the role of our families in this process. Right? نقش فامیل ما چی است در میالت؟ در امریکا چون که اینجا یک فرهنگ اندیویدوالیستیک است، یعنی که کلگی در قصه خود است، کلگی غم خود میخوره، میره پشت کار، میره پشت پیسه، صرف در چیز در قصه خود است. In all it, we have to ask the question در می مملکت بسیار غریب که باشه، یک مملکت بسیار غنی، اچ کار داشته باشی، اچ که بخوای و دست میتونی بیاری، اینجا بره. در افغانستان این گپا نیست، بخاطر افغانستان یک مملکت بسیار غریب است. نه؟ So how is it چطور امکان داشته باشه که کسی که اینجا که باشه، در میجا هم کلان شده باشه، میخوای خودکشی کنه؟ How is that even possible? Right? در فرهنگ ما شما این گپا هیچ نیست. خودکشی هیچ نیست. اگر باشه بسیار کم است.
فیصدی کم است. بله. بسیار کم.
So we have to ask چطور امکان داشته باشه که در خود امریکا امی خودکشی به یه اندازه کس چرا قدر زیاد است؟ سببش چی است؟ اینا به نظر من هر سایکولوژیست که پرسون کنی سببش اگر راست خود بگه سببش تنهایی است. So ما مردم افغانستان که امی PTSD که ما داریم، امی مشکلات PTSD که ما که پیش ما است، اگر شبکه بسیار نزدیک می داشته باشه، مثلا فامیل، مثلا چیزایی که مرا نجات داد، کسی که مرا نجات داد مادرم بود. چرا؟ با خاطر که من صرف تنها افغانستان نرفتم، بابیم کدم بود 3 سال. پدرم رفت افغانستان از بحث ترجمان، قندارم ترجمانی میکرد. 3 سال مکمل مسلم آوری در افغانستان بود. سر تا سر افغانستانم دید، امی خرابیایشم دید، جنگایشم دید، کلش. در زندانم کار میکرد، موجم ترجمانی هم میکرد، قندار. منظورم چی است؟ ما و پدرم اردو ما PTSD داشتیم. باز ما که پس آمدم به پنسیلوانیا، یگانه کسی که ما رو کمک کرد مادرم بود. چرا؟ هر چیز که ما کار داشت مادر میامد بچیم چی رو کار داری؟ امروز نان خوردی، امروز خوتان پوره شد. این یک مقبولی، یک خوبی مادر افغان است. اگر چرا گپا رو میزنم، اگر مادرم به می اندازه در قصه من نمی بود، I don't know if I'd be okay. I don't know if my father would be okay. And I share this with you because Western mothers, in some sense, don't have the same level of engagement. Right? So young Afghans, they find it annoying when their mother calls them. Ash ba sob ki shawa zang mezan bachim tu chtorasti khautan purash non khordi choy khordi saatmandasti degasti, and their son is 35 years old. 15 سال میشه کوچم کده از خانه. باز هم دیگه مادر زنگ میزنه. You know بالاخره کسی که در خانه تان باشه میگه باز هم مادرم زنگ میزنه. صحیح؟ It can be somewhat annoying, but at the same time, when somebody's suffering from an experience whereby the single most important thing that you need is to not feel alone and to feel like you're seen, So the perspective is different, right? So the idea of isolation in the Western culture, if you're suffering from isolation, literally in your head and you're stuck in your own head, کس نیست که نزدیکتان بیه، که غمتان بخوره، که احوالتان بگیره، باز در وقت زیادتر مریض میشی، زیادتر با تکلیف میباشی. In all it, نقش افغانات چی است؟ خصوصا واقع بسیار مثلا مادرها، they can help the men in their lives. چی همسرشان باشه، چی کاکایشان باشه، چی پدرشان باشه، چی بچهشان باشه. Because that is socially acceptable. مرد به مرد که بگه بچیم مثلا, it's harder for me to tell other men that, you know, this is what I'm dealing with. But I can tell my female cousin. I can tell my mother. And so if people gather anything from this conversation, let it be this. There's certain people in your lives that can help you find comfort in talking about the things that are most difficult to talk about. Find them, tell them. And most likely they're going to be, as a man, they're most likely going to be female, because that's culturally acceptable in our culture. And so just to recap, the difference between Western Afghan culture is that the idea of isolation is very different in the context of the West. Isolation is almost celebrated. که من خودم شخصا امی چیزا به دست آوردم. امی خودم شخصا امی مشکلات تیر کردم. امی خودم شخصا ای چیزا رو کردم. In Afghan culture, it's collective. So there are negative aspects to that too, but in the context of dealing with mental health, it's a huge plus.
I will say this, Baktash, that not only is it an Afghan culture that men feel more comfortable relaying feelings to female support system, but also in Western, I do have non-Afghan clients that I deal with. And there is this, it's a gender thing. It's a gender thing. It's a gender thing because men feel, like you were saying before, you mentioned the competitive nature of men. Men like to discuss sports with other men. Men like to discuss accomplishments, accolades, because this puts their natural, again, men and women are created differently for a reason. Genetically, men are competitive. Even, hunters, gatherers, this is just part of the animal world, right? The way that men are. So even within conversation, when they are discussing things, it's almost as if it's a competition. So it's very, very difficult for, unless that relationship from male to male is so strong and those people are so incredibly comfortable with one another. There are times when I've seen it work, but it's rare. I will say it's a very rare thing. I have clients who come to me, non-Afghan males, Caucasian or what have you, and say, I feel comfortable speaking to you about this because I don't want other men to think that I've lost my machismo or I've lost my, masculinity or whatever it is that they have in their mind. They don't feel comfortable sharing things because they don't want to feel like, quote unquote, less of a man. A couple of things that you brought up that I wanted to touch on was that absolutely, and support systems. Mm-hmm. I recently had a client who reached out to me, and Afghan. She was going through a very difficult time in her marriage, and she attempted suicide. Mm-hmm. And here in the United States, and I when we went through the assessment and when I had the conversation with her and I asked her, I went through kind of like the checklist, and what I realized was that she did not have a support system here. Mm-hmm. She was isolated. She had these problems, but other than me, a neutral professional, I cannot, play the role of a sister or a mother or, anybody, a familial role. I was obviously the professional in the scenario. The sequence of events that led to her attempted suicide were really her feelings of isolation and being alone. So one of the most important things that comes up in every session, and what I've noticed in people that have the most problems, are these people who do not have friends, who do not have family, who do not have this very strong support system. And thank God you had your mother, John, to be able to help you through that. And for those people who don't have mothers or who don't have that person to go to, you really, really want to surround yourself with this circle. And in this circle, even though we live in this individualistic society, we can still bring the values of collective societies into our personal lives on a different scale. It's not going to be the same as Afghanistan, where something happens, every extended relative is involved in the situation, or two people fight and you have, it's like a court system where it's a tribal society, people get together and they have this great way of solving things. It's very, very different. And a leading cause of depression of Afghan Americans in this country is that. بسیاری از مشکلات کلان که می‌بینیم در امریکا، مخصوصاً افغانایی که نویج میآیند، بسیار برشان یک خانم بود که کوشش کرد که خدا بکشه. الحمدلله که زنده است، اما کوشش کرد. و در شفاخانه بودم راش که صحبت کردم، از پیشش که پرسیدم اینجا فامیل داری، خوار داری، بیادر داری، کی داری؟ گفت هیچ کس متاسفانه ندارم و شوهرم سرم ظلم میکنه و دیگه من نمیخوایم در دنیا باشم. بسیار تنها خود احساس میکنه. و این حالی که در افغانستان که هسته خویم یک گپ کوچکم که میشه تمام سوسایتی جمع میشه، خاله، ما، کاکا، همگی. اینجا امکاناتش نیست، اما امکاناتش هسته که یک برای خود در زندگی شخصی خود یک سیستم بسازین که اگر مادر نباشه، خاله باشه، دختر عمه باشه، هر کسی که باشه که همراهش یا اعتبار داشته باشی، او سر خودت اعتبار داره و خودت سرش اعتبار داری. این بسیار مهم است. And one of the leading causes of depression and anxiety and many mental health issues is this feeling of trauma and then isolation, right? So the traumatic event happens and then automatically you feel isolated because there's nobody. We're always going to fall, but who's going to pick us up when we fall? There's always going to be an instance where we're going to face something traumatic. And like you were saying before, I just want to add this last point in, is that trauma, you know, a normal reaction to trauma is triggers in your memory. But don't look at yourself as a victim. I really don't like this word. In the English language, victim is like one of the words I really don't like. I like survivor. Empower yourself. I went through a very difficult ordeal, and now I am a survivor. یک بسیار مشکل بسیار سخت سرم تیر شد، بسیار چیزای خراب دیدم به چشم خود. جنگ بود، کشتن بود، قتل بود، غریبی بود، بسیار مسکین، ظلم بود، right؟ اما تیر شد، تحمل کردم، تیر شد و بهتر میشم. Right? Empower yourself in the way that you see things. Look at things in a certain perspective. Don't be afraid to ask for help. This is the problem with Afghans. We have so much pride. یک مغرور بسیار قوی داریم, right? Like, نه کمک کردن ندارم. No, امکانش نیست. غیر از الله سبحانه و تعالی، خداوند تعالی، دیگه همه کریشنش و همه چیزی را که ساخته در دنیا کوشش کرده. You know, even if you read Islamic scripture, right? I made you in pairs. We're meant to be around people, and we're meant to be in groups with other people to help us and support us and get us through situations. And I know that recently, Baktash شما رفته بودین افغانستان برای یک پروژه و میخواستم اگه میتونستین کوتاه وارد صحبت کنین راجع به امی the experience that you had in Kabul and when you did this Art Lord project, anything you wanted to share about the experience, we would love to hear it.
Sure. I'd be happy to talk about that. Just one little caveat I'd like to add to what you shared about isolation is that, you know, if we look at prisons in the United States, solitary confinement is the ultimate punishment for misbehaving in prison.
Yes.
And so what's interesting is the idea of solitary confinement happens when we do something wrong to others in the context of prison. But if you see yourself as a victim and if you see yourself as somebody who's at fault for the thing that you experienced, then you yourself are succumbing yourself to isolation, meaning solitary confinement, meaning you're putting yourself in this box.
Yeah.
So just remember, like you said, relationships are the single most important thing that we need to feel whole again.
Absolutely.
You know, and I can't remember who said this, but this is really important to think about. It's like, you know, the single most important currency that one can acquire or that one can give is the way they make other people feel. And so we as human beings, we all need to be seen for who we are, and we need to be accepted for being that person. So this idea of being authentic and being loved for that person is what all of us need, even if we've had experiences related to trauma. So I just want to add just so everybody understands.
No, that's such an important point, and such a poignant thing to say is acceptance. That's another root of these issues. Absolutely, not feeling accepted. Most mental health issues come from this feeling of isolation and not being accepted for who we are. So thank you for adding that. That's incredibly important for the viewers to know.
My pleasure. And so قصه افغانستان خب ما در ماه داخل ماه نوامبر و شروع ماه دسامبر من رفتم افغانستان. آخرین بار که ما در افغانستان بودم در سال 2012 بود داخلش. باز در مو وقت من 3 سال در افغانستان بودم از بحث ترجمان. باز من که پس آمدم امریکا نه فرصت بود نه من میخواستم پس برم افغانستان، اما فرصت پیش آمد که من برم افغانستان. باز گفتم اوکی حالا وقتش است که من پس برم. قبول کردم، پس رفتم. خب یک تجربه بسیار خوشیم بود، هم یک تجربه بسیار تلخم بود. قسمت اولش میگم که خوشیش چی است. I went for an Art Lords conference where I saw که تمام جوانان افغانستان از هر ولایت می آمدن کابل که امی رنجار که وا دیدن، امی ضرر که وا داشتن قلبشان. یک جای آمدن، یک جای شدن، امرا یکی دیگر شریک ساختن که این چیزا رو من میبینم، این چیزا رو من احساس میکنم. تجربه خودتان چطور است؟ خودت چطور میبینی افغانستان؟ امی زندگی شما اصلا چطور است؟ So it was a place where young people could come together and talk about their lived experience. And when I, being at this Art Lords conference, seeing young people from all over Afghanistan, it یک خوشی برم داد که جوانان افغانستان چون که وا چیز ندیدن، یعنی که انوزم بسیار خوشبین هستن. They're very full of hope. And so as a result, it makes me hopeful. So that's the positive. And the negative was that بیرون که بری خود بیرون که بری معلوم میشه که افغانستان روز به روز خراب شده میره. Right? خشونت روز به روز زیاد شده میره. Violence هر جای است. روز یک دفعه، یگان دفعه، 2 دفعه یکن تاری میشه. And people are scared to quite literally embrace and or go outside. So some people, again, there's a major correlation between religiosity and chaos, right? And so that's really important to kind of consider as you think about Afghanistan and the way in which people live and act in Afghanistan. So the violence is very, very, very prominent and prevalent. هر کس که پرسان کنه با خود چطور هستی فاطمه جان، چطور هستی احمد جان؟ خب امروز زنده هستم. And so it's important to kind of understand that, this dictates people's notion of time. This dictates people's notion of who they are and what they want. So if you can't plan for tomorrow or next week or next year, you are living day to day. And so we have to ask, what does that do to people? As a matter of psychology, kuligi sirf sarmroz fikr mekunan. Okay? Ba khubi, ba kharabi. Khubi shiz ke, there's not so much stress related to life if you think about just today. Sayis? Ami khubi shaz. Badish cheez. جان زدن و دزدی کردن و قتل کردن زیاد شده در کابل. زیاد شده میره. با خاطر که مردم یک چیز به نام سیج منتالیتی، چیزی کس میتونیم چور است گفته افغانا. چور است. And so امی تلخیش است که in addition to COVID, all the stuff that I'm sharing with you is happening. And so, it's very difficult to kind of understand where Afghanistan is going. The Western media is now not sharing the attacks, the bombs, and that's intentional, right? Because the United States is a matter of its, of its investment in Afghanistan, doesn't want to show that it's gotten Afghanistan completely wrong, And kulagi ke, tamam Afghanistan commissioner si, everybody has a cousin or a nephew can make a koko John چطور مرا میتونه بیاره آمریکا چطور خود بکشم از افغانستان اگر راست خود براتون بگم کلگی میخوای از افغانستان برای I'm sure you have phone calls. I'm sure your family has phone calls, and everybody's trying to find a way out.
Absolutely. I think I get at least 5 emails a day. Please sponsor me.
That's the reality, right? Like if we're going to be honest about it, Afghanistan's not in a good place. And so, people often think about like, how is it that we can save Afghanistan? How is it that we can help Afghanistan? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer. I think that's up to everybody individually. But I think what I've learned is that Afghanistan, the young people of Afghanistan have to do 2 things. And this is the message. Ami payama mabud bar jawanat Afghanistan ma ke raftam. Unja raftam amrashan sohbat kardam wara ba hisab nasihat mekardam. Payama ma in bud ke you can't control what happens in your life, but you can control the meaning that you give to the things that happen in your life. Says یعنی که چیزایی که در زندگی ما که رخ بده او اصلا در دست ما نیست. چی در دست ما است؟ اما مفهوم که میتیشه. چی مفهوم میتیشه امورا؟ یک مفهوم بسیار مثبت یا منفی میتیشه. کدامش است؟ او انتخاب خودتان است. So that's where your power resides. The ability to choose the meaning that you give to the things that happen to you. یکی. دومش چی است؟ جوانان یک چیز دیگه باید بکنن. جرأت باید پیدا کنید که کلانا رو باید بگوین که بابا جان، کاکا جان، بیبی جان، چیزایی که شما میگین، طرز فکر که شما دارین غلط است. Respect is fantastic to a limit. هر چیز یک حد داره. بعض کسا، بعض فامیلا هرچی که بابا میگه من میکنم و گفتش میکنم. هرچی که مادر میگه من میکنم من با گفتش میکنم. If you do it without thinking critically, it's to your detriment. Yeah. So young people, this is the single most important thing that I tell. I live in Washington, D.C., and I taught diplomats for 4 years who are going to Afghanistan. And the single most important thing that American can give Afghanistan is the ability to critically think. Tradition is good, but not all tradition is good. Culture is good, but not all aspects of culture is good. And so, جوانان باید بگن که باید یاد بگیرن که اوکی قسم که ما کردیم قسم که کلانا میکنن با فایده یعنی که actually it hurt us. And so young people have to essentially have the courage to tell their elders sometimes that that's not what they want to do with their lives.
And also just to piggyback on that thought, very important thought. First of all, I want to say we are not encouraging by any which way any type of disrespect or rebellious behavior. We're not saying that. No. What we're saying is that critically think for yourself and think for your future. Let's be very, very real. We, for the most part, minimum 40 years have been in this country. If you look back at the last 40 years, if we could be really real with ourselves and do some really, really deep soul searching, those mentalities and those attributes of our culture has not done that much for us, have not allowed us to grow and flourish as a community and as a diaspora in this country. It absolutely has not. I will never, ever accept that notion. It has not done anything but hinder our progress. ما نمیگیم خدا نخواسته که شما به احترامی یا به گفتی مادر پدر اصلا این نصیحت نمیدیم. این نصیحت بکتاش جان و خودمون براتون میدیم که باید است که شما فکر کنین، آینده خود فکر کنین و هر کاری که میکنین بسیار فکر کنین. همه چیز در فرهنگ و کلتور ما صحیح نیست. درست بسیاری چیزا احترام من مخصوصا بسیار دوست دارم احترامی که افغانا دارن the whole Asian culture and respect. I think it's a very, very beautiful thing. And when I was in high school and I was growing up and I was looking at people in my class and how, you know, they were addressing their parents with curse words and very disrespectfully, I don't like that. I do love the core issues and values that help us in our character development. بسیار چیزاست که اخلاق ما رو بهتر میسازه از فرهنگ کلتور ما و دین ما. این ما نمیگیم که نحسه نکنین، اما اگه ما فکر کنیم و راستی شق نباشیم، خود فکر کنیم که در ظرف 40 سال که در این مملکت هستیم کدام پیشرفت کردیم، کجا رسیدیم، right؟ از نگاه سیاسی، از نگاه civic engagement، رقم که شما فکر کنین آل آستاستا شروع شده، آل آستاستا جوانای ما و فکر خود به پای خود استاد هستن و به فکرهای قدیمانه دور میرن. اما اگر فکر کنین they chose solve metan. And from the get-go, there was a lot of things in our culture that hindered us. So thank you so much for bringing it up. Some way
yeah, and there's something else too as لازم یک طرز فکر که همین مشکل ما واناست. ما میشه در گذشته زندگی میکنیم.
Yes.
And this is completely counter to what it means to be American. What do I mean? The United States and its foundation is the land of opportunity because it's the land where people aspire to do things. كل جدا أمريكا ده فكرة هاي داس. چطور میفهمی؟ کسی که پیشتان بیه مثلا از مکتب که خلاص شدی از مکتب که فارغ شد براتون میگه اوکی تبریک باشه دیگه چی میکنی؟ در حیدت چی میکنی؟ کار you know next project چی هست؟ یا میگه که خوب فرشته از افغانستان آمدی چطور بود؟ خوب بود؟ اوکی حالا چی میکنی؟ حالا چی میکنی؟ یعنی که they're always asking what the next step is.
Right.
صحیح؟ هیچ وقت پرسانه میگه خوب فرشته جان بابا کلانت کیست؟ بابا کلانت هیچ رب نداری. خود یک نفر شخصی هستین. خود کی هستی؟ خود چی کارا کردی؟ خود چی به دست آوردین؟ You know what I mean? خب هیچ کس امریکا پرسان میگه خب چقدر زمین داشتن؟ خب پدر کلانت خب همی خود وکیل قندار بود به شک به خدا. یعنی که we live in the past in Afghanistan.
Oh man.
Don't even worry about that. And that's the thing is like, of all that, there's two things that I think, you know, Afghans really need to think deep and hard about in terms of the things that hinder our progress. And it's our relationship with time. That's how I'm convinced it's our relationship with time. And it's expressed through language.
Brilliant.
Right? It's like, we often say, oh, فرشته جان خب کجایستن؟ خب کابلیستن. درست کدام قسمت کابل؟ اوکی چقدر زمین داشتن؟ Oh my God بابا کلانت همین مدیر آریانا نبود؟ And so, it's funny because it's true. Like, do Americans care?
Every conversation that I have.
Because our relationship with time is based in the past. Your identity is based in the past.
True.
And all Americans, they don't care because your identity is based on where you're going. Right? So, like, if you look at the largest section of the bookstore in terms of where the most books reside, take a guess in terms of what it is. Just take a guess. What do you think?
Me? Oh, history?
Yeah. So well, yeah, just so to demonstrate this point, what do you think it is? The largest section of a bookstore in the United States?
The largest part of a bookstore. History?
No. Again, فکر افغانی دارین شما.
افغانی رو گفتم.
It's self-help. It's the idea of reinventing oneself. This is what this country is founded in. This is what this country values. So, remember, you are allowed to recreate yourself. In fact, it's expected of you. Nobody in America is going to ask you, چقدر زمین داشتن؟ کارتان چی بود در افغانستان؟ چرا این چیزا دمیجه هیچ ارزش نداره. So I think Afghans have to change their relationship with time the moment they leave Afghanistan. When you go back, parce que bari watan sais, igapocho sais. It's a different system. Amo system Amerikایی است که همیشه کلی پرسون خود دیگه چی میکنی؟ دیگه چی به دست میاری؟ سبا چی میکنی؟ گپ سر امروز نیست، گپ سر سباست.
Also, Baktash, just to kind of close that in, the other side of it, also don't bring people down. I hear a lot of conversations like, you know, this person just became a doctor. Oh, wait, doctor شده در کابل خو بابیش موتروان بود. You know, like the opposite, right? Like you hear this person is a successful person and has made something of themselves, but somehow they're not, it doesn't matter that they're successful because their grandfather was a driver for somebody in Kabul. You know, I'm just using this random example. اما بسیار شرم است. بسیار شرم کلان که یایی که مثلا یک کسی یک دکتر میشه یا یک وکیل میشه، انجینیر میشه، یک کارا میشه در امریکا و بعد از او نفر او رو برابر میسازی میگی اوه در نظرم هیچ نمیاد. بابا کلانش در کابل موتروان ما بود. این بسیار غلط است. اصلا این گفته بکتاش جان ارزش نداره. It really doesn't matter. And you're right, we need to get over this. And that's why I was chuckling, because it's nice, it's refreshing to hear that that you know somebody else has this point of view and this way of thinking. And I personally get very annoyed when I have these kind of conversations and I get like frustrated and I have to explain the whole process, like you said, of, you know, walk into Barnes and Nobles and there's a whole section on this for dummies, this for, you know, all these books on self-help and how to do things on your own. And essentially the ironic part about all of this, the irony in this, is that of all the other diasporas, we're the ones who need the self-help the most. That's the irony behind this. As امریکایی ملک وطنشون است. و خبر مثل ما که اینقدر self-help کار داریم از ما که خود کسی دیگه نیست. You know, that's the irony behind it, which I always find very interesting.
And if I may add something else too, it's, you know, the one way to kind of share is the idea of changing our relationship with time. And then the other way to kind of understand it too is Afghanistan is a place of scarcity, meaning people have a scarcity mindset in Afghanistan. Who bache kakaim ami position girifta khode, you know, daftar, you name the daftar. There's only one position, and so he got it. So that leads to extra competition. So in those instances, because there's only one position. If he gets it, you don't get it. Simple math.
True.
So there's a scarcity of opportunity in a place of Afghanistan. Right? There's a scarcity of opportunity. There's a scarcity of money in a place of Afghanistan. So everybody that Johnny Yaki, they got a mezanan. Right? And this isn't specific to Afghanistan. This exists in all poor communities. Here in the United States, it exists too. They believe poverty is not a lack of money. It's not just a lack of money or lack of opportunity. It's the belief that there is a lack of money and a lack of opportunity. Okay? So that leads people to act. It leads people to, you know, put other people down. Create, you know, gossip and or narratives about a person so they can't get ahead, right? Absolutely. That's the scarcity mindset. In the United States, again, this is the beauty of the United States. This place in this country is a country of abundance. هرچی که کار داشته باشی، هرچی که بخوایی، هرچی که میخوای به دست بیاری، هست اینجا. تنها من نه، فرشته جان، احمد جان، قیوم جان، فاطمه جان، کل ما میتونیم یک چیز شویم اینجا. It's the country of abundance. And that's the thing that we have to get over, is that all of a sudden there are enough medical schools for all of us to become a doctor. Not, you know what I mean? There are enough hospitals where all of us can practice medicine.
Khush, Baktash John. You know, there was like so much that I wanted to discuss with you, and there's just not enough time.
Of course, Mesha, قبول است. خدمت شما هستم.
Wonderful. So Baktash, if you had any closing thoughts or advice that you wanted to share with our viewers, unfortunately we are running out of time, but we would love to hear your final thoughts.
Sure. The one message I want people to kind of gather from this conversation and the work that kind of do is, my belief is that freedom exists on the other side of vulnerability. And so in order to get to a place of being vulnerable with others, you have to have the courage to get there. You have to have the courage to confront your own demons, to question assumptions that you've been given throughout your life, either from school, your teachers, your friends, your parents. Question those assumptions. Understand who you are in the life and the story that you're telling yourself. Constantly be editing your own life story. That is something that you have the power to do. And once you get into a place whereby you are comfortable reconciling all those things that you've been dealing with, then you're in a place to essentially share those with other people. And that whole process is what it means to be authentic. That whole process is what it means to be free. And so in order to do that, you have to look within. You have to explore the inner landscape. And so I want that message to kind of go out to your audience, is that freedom exists on the other side of vulnerability, and vulnerability is a strength if you've done the work.
اگه میرم داری کوتاه ترجمه کنیم میشه خوب میشه.
خب کوشش خود میکنم بگی تا حالا کارا خود نکردم. خب منظورم است که قصای خودت، قصای زندگیت همیشه در دست خودتان هست. یعنی که امو قصه که خودتان میگی که من کی هستم، از کجا آمدم، در می دنیا چی میشم، او اصلا در دست خودتان هست. این اگه میخوای آزادی خود پیدا کنی، you have to show me امی نقطه ضعیف خود هم باید قبول کنی، هم باید بگی مردمه. از طریق از امی طریق میتونی آزادی خود پیدا کنی. در غیر زو همیشه خودت یک زندان برای خود جور میکنی. این حال اگر میخوای کار بکنی، چی ضرورت است؟ جرأت ضرورت است. جرأت که پیدا کنی، میتونی امی آزادی خود پیدا کنی. Just remember that having the strength to tell people what you're dealing with is the most important thing in the world.
حتما و چون ما افغان هستیم، شکر الحمدلله در قلب دل ما بیازو شیر دل هستیم. And we have that within us, every single one of us. That I don't doubt at all. Baktash Ahadi, thank you so much for joining us today on our show. If you have any questions or comments, our number is at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to either call us or write in the comments below, and we'll answer them. اگر کدام سوال داشته باشین برای بکتاش میتونین که کامنتاتون نوشته کنین در زیر اسکرین یا در اون نمره که نوشته است زنگ بزنید. بازم بکتاش جان یک جهان سپاس که امروز خود همراه ما تیر کردین و انشالله امیدوار هستیم که باز در برنامه ما بیاییم که باز پادکستتان راجع به موضوع صحبت کنیم. بخیر stories of transformation میخوایم بسیار علاقه‌مند هستیم که راجع به موضوع صحبت کنیم دیگه دفعه و بازم از طرف صدای حق تلویزیون برای همتان روز شب خوش میخوایم و همچنان در هر نقطه دنیا باشین خوش و آرام باشین. تشکر. خدا حافظ.